Right, so let's just start. Welcome everyone. Today I'm very happy to have Professor Rui Wang with us from Tsinghua University in Beijing. And he and his colleagues, they published a paper on the south to north water diversion project in China. And in particularly, we're investigating how it impacts the groundwater table in the metropolitan area of Beijing, and how this then in turn causes seismic ground liquefaction issues in Beijing. So before we dive into your work, can you maybe give us a brief overview of what the South to North Water Diversion Project is across China?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the South to North Water Diversion Project is actually a project that aims to provide water to the north of China, especially in the Hubei plain, which has a dense population and is generally has low precipitation, and it has a lack of general water usage. So a lack of water resources and a lot of water usage. So the problem there is in many cities in the Hubei plain, there has been over the past 50 to even 60 years, we have been drawing groundwater from underground, and then that has caused the groundwater level to continuously drop in this area, in Shandong, in Hebei, in Tianjin, and in Beijing. And so that has obviously during the past few decades caused a lot of problems, including ecological problems, including ground settlement, which has been studied previously quite a lot. So the South to North Water Diversion Project is actually now two routes have been implemented, the east route and the central route. And these routes aim to divert water from the south, which is generally there's a more abundance of water resources in South China. So its goal is to divert water from the south all the way to the north to the Hubei plain. And then the central route diverts water from the Yangtze River basin all the way to the north, with its ultimate destination being Beijing, which is the capital of China. It started to function in 2015, and since its beginning of function, it has actually we've seen it has had a really good impact on raising the groundwater level and then easing the use of groundwater. So right now we're seeing groundwater level rises in Beijing, and also because when I came to Beijing in 2005, most of the water that we used at the university, so I was at Tsinghua University then, most of the water that we used were groundwater drawn from underground. And now the water usage for urban life in Beijing is mostly water that's diverted from the south. From Danjiangkou. So that has actually changed a lot of our patterns for water usage. And yeah, that's basically what the South to North Water Diversion Project is.
Okay, thank you. And can you give us a bit more information about how much did the groundwater table raise in the past years, and how did you measure it? How many measurements did you take across Beijing or in the metropolitan area of Beijing?
So when I was talking about the groundwater table from previously, before the South to North Water Diversion Project, the groundwater table depth in Beijing actually increased from 11 meters, which was in 1996. So the average water depth was 11 meters then. And then in 2015, which is the year of the lowest recorded groundwater depth, that was actually 28 meters before the implementation of the South to North Water Diversion Project. And then since then, we've seen gradual rise of the groundwater table. And then right now, I think the groundwater table is at about 14 meters depth. So we're almost near 1996 levels.
Okay, yeah, so we're almost coming back to the original groundwater table. Then my next question would be, why is this now causing issues in particular towards ground liquefaction if we are coming back to levels where we have been before?
Well, so this is actually quite an interesting finding that we observed, is that because previously we had a relatively high groundwater table, so you would anticipate previously when you have a major earthquake, if your soils are mostly sand or silt, then you could have quite a significant liquefaction. And that is actually what we observed historically in Beijing. So the closest observation was in the Tangshan earthquake in the 1970s, where the earthquake struck Hebei, which is about 100 kilometers from Beijing. And then in Beijing, in areas in Shunyi and in Tongzhou, there was a lot of observation of liquefaction. But at that time, these areas were mostly rural areas in Beijing. So there was not much construction, not much people living there. So it didn't really cause that much damage. And then since then, since the 1980s, basically, Beijing has experienced massive development in the urban areas. So what used to be mostly rural areas like Tongzhou, like Shunyi, are now massively populated. And over the past 2 or 3 decades, we've seen a lot of urban development in terms of residential construction and also infrastructure construction, like underground structures, subways, and roads, airports, and things like that. And many of these structures are planned and constructed in a time where there is really low groundwater table. So in their design and in their construction, there may have been inadequate consideration for liquefaction. And then once the groundwater table rises really quickly, then you have these structures that were constructed in a period where you didn't really consider the liquefaction risk. And now the groundwater table is back to where it was, and it could even rise more in years to come, because like I think in the 1950s, we had the highest average groundwater table in Beijing that was about 4 to 5 meters. So then the liquefaction risk becomes a big problem for these infrastructures that were mostly constructed in a period of low groundwater table.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. So as my final question, or as an outlook, are there any implications for future infrastructure building in Beijing? But also, are there any implications for in terms that you need to now retrofit infrastructure that has been built in the past 10 or 15 years to adapt to the higher groundwater levels?
Yeah, I think you point to 2 very critical issues. So one is for the infrastructure that was built during the years with low groundwater table. Then what we need to do right now is we need to reassess their seismic risk and see whether their sites are going to experience liquefaction with higher groundwater table. And we've actually done that as some of that work in the paper that is going to be published. So what we found was that 6 of the major lines in Beijing, subway lines in Beijing, when their stations were constructed, they had the sites that they were in had no liquefaction hazard. But then if we project the groundwater table for 2030, then we will see they will experience a medium to even severe levels of liquefaction in 2030. So we need to then reassess whether their original design would be able to sustain the kind of or endure the kind of seismic level that may hit Beijing over their design period, I guess. And then if they cannot survive that kind of seismic risk, then we will have to make mitigation efforts to try and improve their seismic stability. And so that's one of the issue. Another issue, I think it would be to looking forward when we plan. So Beijing is still planning a lot of infrastructure construction, especially underground space, tunnels and subways. For the future planning, we need to consider the rise in groundwater table. So for example, if I were to construct a subway line or subway station this year in 2025, then I think we need to consider down the line in 10 years, 20 years, how high will our water table be? So I think these are two issues or two takeaways that we need to consider.
Okay, cool. Well then, thank you very much for talking us through your work and for the issues or problems that come with restoring water to an area that has a lack of water. I think that's very interesting work. And yeah, thanks again for your time. And
thank you. I mean, if I may, I would just like to add another point.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think that the work is well, we use Beijing as kind of like a case study, an example. But I think the findings, the implications of the findings are not really just on Beijing, because in many areas around the world, you could see this pattern where you have urban development, and then you have increase in urban population, and then that increase in urban population and urban development would pose a pressure on water resources, and then you tend to start depleting groundwater in these areas. And then during this time, that's where your city develops, your city booms, and then a lot of construction work goes on. And then that often coincides with the time where you have low groundwater table. And then once your economy reaches a certain level, your life reaches a certain level, then you start considering in any country, I guess, you start considering we should actually restore the groundwater. And then the same story would happen around the world, I guess. And as long as you're in a seismically active area and then you have liquefaction prone soils, then you may also experience this kind of risk. So I think that's a takeaway point as well of this study.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. That makes a lot of sense, in particular, as you say, for areas that are currently undergoing rapid urban development and building of infrastructure. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well then, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian.